The rocket exploded 4 times. Every time, they told no one. The largest non-nuclear explosion in the history of rocketry happened on July 3, 1969, 6 days before Apollo 11 launched. The blast vaporized a launch pad the size of a city block, sent burning propellant raining down for half a mile, and obliterated 12 months of assembly work in approximately 15 seconds. Men who were there described the shockwave knocking them off their feet from distances that should have been safe. The Americans were not told. The Soviet public was not told. The rocket, the explosion, the casualties, all of it was sealed behind a classification system so total that Western intelligence agencies spent years debating whether the program even existed. The Soviet government did not acknowledge this launch vehicle until 1990, 20 years after the explosion, 20 years after the dust had settled on a launch pad that was not supposed to exist. The rocket was called the N-1. It stood taller than the Statue of Liberty. At liftoff, it produced more thrust than any machine in human history. It was the instrument the Soviet Union built to put a cosmonaut on the moon before Neil Armstrong put his boot in the lunar dust. Instead, it became the most thoroughly erased engineering program of the 20th century, stripped from public records, denied by the government that commissioned it, and buried in classified archives for 2 decades. This briefing covers the full record: the origin of the program, the design of the vehicle, all 4 launch attempts, the mechanics of the cover-up, and what the declassified evidence now confirms about how close the Soviet Union actually came to winning the moon race, not the summary version, the full file. If this is the kind of briefing you want more of, hit subscribe and stay with me. The mission begins now. Pull up the mission architecture. The year is 1957. The Soviet Union has just launched a Sputnik, a polished metal sphere the size of a beach ball, broadcasting a radio signal that anyone on Earth with a shortwave receiver could hear. The American reaction was not admiration, it was institutional panic. Not because of the satellite itself, because of what had launched it. The rocket that carried a Sputnik into orbit was an R-7, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead from Soviet territory to any city in the continental United States. The Soviets had demonstrated in a single launch both the technical capability and the strategic will to weaponize space. The race that followed was not primarily a scientific competition. It was a demonstration. Every milestone achieved in orbit was a claim about national power, about which political system, communism or liberal democracy was entitled to the future. When President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress in May 1961 and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, he was not setting a scientific objective. He was setting a political ultimatum with a specific calendar deadline. The Soviet Union publicly denied any competition. Official statements described Soviet space efforts as purely scientific. They were peaceful. They were for the benefit of all mankind. The Soviets said this calmly and officially while simultaneously pouring resources equivalent to hundreds of billions of present-day dollars into a lunar program that, at its peak, employed hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of facilities stretching from Moscow to the remote steppes of Kazakhstan. The man running that program was not publicly known. Western intelligence agencies called him only the chief designer. He had no public name. He gave no interviews. He made no television appearances. His identity was one of the most classified facts in the Soviet Union, a man whose achievements had reshaped the world, whose name the world was not permitted to know. His name was Sergei Korolev. Korolev was responsible for the Sputnik, for Laika, for Yuri Gagarin's flight, for every Soviet space achievement from 1957 through the mid-1960s. By almost every metric of the earliest space age, the Soviet Union was not just competing with the United States, it was leading. First satellite, first animal in orbit, first human in space, first spacewalk, first multi-person crew, first spacecraft to reach another world. The list is long and not disputed. The trajectory of that list pointed logically toward a Soviet boot on the lunar surface. By 1961, Korolev was already designing the rocket that would get there. He called it the N-1. On paper, it would be the most powerful launch vehicle ever built, producing 10.2 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The Saturn V, which NASA was simultaneously developing, produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The N-1 was supposed to exceed it by a third. This is the scale of what the Soviet Union was attempting, not a marginal effort, not a gesture toward the moon, a genuine, technically ambitious program that, on paper, in 1961, in 1962, in 1963, had a legitimate chance of arriving first, which is why the story of what actually happened between 1965 and 1974 is not a story about inevitability. The Soviets were not fated to lose. They lost because of specific decisions, specific failures of management, and one specific death that left the program without the single person who might have been able to save it. That is when the investigation found something the official record buried for 20 years. Open the personnel file. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was born in 1907 in what is now Ukraine. He was arrested in 1938 during the Stalin's Great Purge, accused of sabotaging the very rocket program he had founded. He was tortured during interrogation. A Soviet document from 1940 records that his jaw was broken by investigators. He confessed to charges that were fabricated entirely. He was sentenced to death, had the sentence commuted, and spent years in the Gulag, including time in the gold mines at Kolyma, where the average prisoner's life expectancy was measured in months. He survived. He was transferred to a Sharashka, a prison laboratory where arrested engineers were put to work for the estate, and spent the war designing aircraft components in captivity. In 1944, he was released. The charges were never officially dropped. The conviction was never expunged. For the rest of his life, Korolev remained on the books, a convicted traitor to the Soviet state. The Soviet state nonetheless gave him unlimited resources and absolute authority over its most consequential technology program. This was the Soviet system operating at its characteristic extreme. Results were extracted through a combination of enormous concentration of resources and extraordinary disregard for the human cost of extracting them. Korolev received what he needed because what he was building was what the state needed, and he understood earlier than almost anyone in the Soviet apparatus that rockets were not just weapons. They were the long-term architecture of civilization. He fought inside a military-industrial system that wanted only intercontinental missiles to carve out space for scientific and human spaceflight. Sputnik was his compromise, a scientific mission bolted onto an ICBM program. Gagarin's flight was the same logic applied at a larger ambition. By 1961, when Kennedy announced the lunar deadline, Korolev was already working on the N-1 concept. The Soviet government approved the program formally in 1964, after years of internal debate that was slower and messier than the NASA authorization process, precisely because the Soviet program was classified and therefore accountable to no one outside the closed political system. This was the first structural problem. NASA had a unified chain of command, a defined goal with a public deadline, and full political visibility. Failure was visible to Congress, to the press, to the American public. That visibility created pressure. That pressure created urgency. And that urgency, applied consistently over a decade, produced Apollo. The Soviet lunar program had none of that. It was classified. It was divided between competing design bureaus with different technical philosophies and different political allies. Korolev himself was locked in a running of bureaucratic war with Valentin Glushko, the Soviet Union's chief rocket engine designer, over propellants. Glushko wanted hypergolic fuels, toxic and complicated but well understood. Korolev wanted liquid oxygen and kerosene, cleaner, more powerful, but more technically demanding. They despised each other personally. The accounts of their enmity are consistent across multiple sources. Glushko had, according to several historical accounts, provided testimony that helped convict Korolev during the 1938 purge. Whether that account is fully documented or partially legend, the two men never reconciled. And Glushko, exercising the leverage he had, refused to build engines for the N-1. Korolev turned to a different bureau. Nikolai Kuznetsov's design office produced the NK-15, a powerful, innovative engine that performed well in isolation. Korolev's solution to the loss of Glushko's more powerful designs was to use 30 NK-15 engines simultaneously in the N-1's first stage. 30 engines, firing in concert, controlled by an analog computer system that had never been tested at this scale. This is the decision that changed everything. Pull up the engineering diagrams. The Saturn V's first stage used 5 F-1 engines. Each one was the most powerful single-chamber rocket engine ever built. 1.5 million pounds of thrust per engine. NASA and Rocketdyne spent years testing those 5 engines, individually, in pairs, in full clusters, on test stands specifically built to absorb the load. They logged thousands of hours of ground test data before the Saturn V ever left the pad. Every known failure mode was identified, documented, and either solved or designed around. The N-1's first stage used 30 NK-15 engines. Together, they were supposed to produce 10.2 million pounds of thrust, more than the Saturn V, more than anything in history. But the Soviet Union had no test stand capable of firing all 30 simultaneously. There was no infrastructure that could support a full-stage ground test. The engines were tested individually, they were tested in small clusters. Then they were assembled into the complete 30-engine configuration and placed directly onto the launch pad. At NASA, this would have been considered by the engineers of that era close to incomprehensible. The American testing philosophy was built on a single principle: find the failure on the ground, find it before it kills someone, find it before it destroys a mission. Ground testing was not just a step in the process, It was the foundation on which everything else was built. The Soviet test philosophy for the N-1 was different. Build it, launch it, learn from what happens. The rationale was partly genuine. They lacked the infrastructure for full-stage ground tests, and building that infrastructure would have taken years and enormous resources. But the rationale was also partly political. Korolev knew the Americans were accelerating. Every month of delay was a month closer to an American moon landing that would end the race before the Soviets arrived. Full ground testing would have taken time they believed they didn't have. So the decision was, fly it and learn from the flight. Now understand why that decision was so dangerous. 30 engines produce 30 sets of combustion vibrations, 30 pressure oscillations, 30 heat signatures interacting with each other through shared plumbing, shared structural members, shared propellant feed lines. When engines fire together, those oscillations can amplify each other. The phenomenon is called combustion instability, and it is one of the most technically difficult problems in rocket engineering. The F-1 engines nearly destroyed the entire Saturn program in 1962, when Rocketdyne engineers discovered a resonance condition, a feedback loop of pressure oscillations that could tear an engine apart from the inside in under 1 second. NASA spent 2 years and the equivalent of hundreds of millions of present-day dollars solving that problem alone. They redesigned the injector plates. They tested. They retested. They documented every iteration. Kuznetsov's NK-15 engines also had combustion instability vulnerabilities. The Soviet engineers knew this. Their solution was a control system called CORD, Control Robotnik Dvigateli, Engine Operation Control, that monitored all 30 engines in real time and could command individual shutdown responses in milliseconds before a failing engine's instability could cascade to its neighbors. CORD was a genuinely impressive piece of analog engineering for the late 1960s. It was also, as the launch record would document in 4 consecutive failures, deeply unreliable when confronted with the full complexity of 30 engines firing simultaneously. The problem was not that CORD failed to detect problems. The problem was that CORD detected problems that weren't there. False readings from sensor artifacts produced by vibration, and responded to those phantom readings with shutdown commands that created the actual cascade failures it was designed to prevent. The architecture of the N-1 was not unsound as a concept. The NK-15 engine was, by most contemporary and retrospective assessments, a genuinely good engine. The problem was the system. 30 individually sound components, combined without full system ground testing, produced emergent behaviors that no one had been able to model, predict, or pre-solve. Now bring up the launch record. Open the incident file. First attempt. The N-1 made its first flight on February 21, 1969. The vehicle lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, cleared the tower, and flew. For approximately 70 seconds, it flew. Then a fire broke out in the tail section. CORD detected anomalous readings and began commanding engine shutdowns, but the sequence of shutdowns removed thrust asymmetrically. With 12 of the 30 engines no longer firing, the vehicle began to veer off its flight path. 50 kilometers downrange from the launch pad, the range safety officer sent the destruct command. The N-1 broke apart in the upper atmosphere. The mission was over in a slightly more than a minute. This was classified immediately telemetry was analyzed, debris was recovered. Engineering teams worked to understand what chord had responded to, whether those responses were algorithmically correct, and what had produced the initial fire. The process was professional and serious. The public was told nothing. Not a single Soviet news outlet published a word. A vehicle 30 stories tall had lifted off, flown for just over a minute, and been destroyed. And the silence that followed was so complete that Western intelligence was uncertain for years whether the event had even occurred. It had occurred, and the second attempt was already being prepared. The second N-1 launch came on July 3, 1969, 6 days before Apollo 11. There are historians who have spent entire careers in Cold War space history and still find something specific in that date. July 3, 1969, 6 days. The question of what a successful second N-1 launch would have meant, practically, politically, historically, does not have a clean answer, because the program was behind in other critical areas beyond the rocket itself. The Soviet lunar lander, the LK spacecraft, had not completed full qualification testing. The life support systems were unfinished. A successful unmanned in-1 flight in July 1969 would not have produced a manned moon landing within months. It would not have changed who planted the flag first, but a successful unmanned launch would have demonstrated that the N-1 could fly. And proof that it could fly would have materially changed the internal political calculus of the program, the funding decisions, the management decisions, the willingness of the Soviet leadership to continue investing in a vehicle that had only ever been seen to fail. The second N-1 did not fly successfully. The vehicle lifted off at 23:18 local time. At approximately 10 seconds after ignition, 10 seconds, a loose bolt was ingested into one of the NK-15 engine turbopumps. The turbopump failed. Cord detected the failure and began shutdown commands. The shutdown sequence produced a pressure spike in the propellant feed lines shared across the engine cluster. Multiple engines simultaneously experienced combustion instability. Thrust dropped sharply. At 23 seconds after liftoff, the N-1 was at an altitude of approximately 200 meters, barely above the tower height, and it was falling. It fell back onto the launch pad. The impact detonated approximately 2,300 metric tons of propellant simultaneously. The explosion was, by multiple first-hand accounts from Soviet engineers who were present that night, the largest non-nuclear man-made explosion since the Second World War. The launch complex was demolished. Structural damage extended across the facility. Concrete bunkers a kilometer from the pad had their reinforced windows blown inward. One engineer's account describes personnel sheltering inside a hardened structure, feeling the floor physically lift beneath them and come back down. Several people were killed. The full casualty figures remain partially classified in Russian archives. 6 days later, Apollo 11 lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at Cape Canaveral, Florida. It carried 3 astronauts, 363 feet of Saturn V rocket, and the cumulative engineering work of 400,000 Americans across a decade. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The Soviet government said nothing about the moon program. There was nothing to say. There was no program. Move the mission clock forward. Baikonur spent 18 months rebuilding the destroyed complex. In that time, the Apollo program landed humans on the moon twice. Apollo 11 in July 1969, Apollo 12 in November 1969. The race, in terms of who would be first, was resolved, but the N1 program continued. The internal logic was partly bureaucratic. Enormous sums had been spent, enormous infrastructure had been built, and admitting the program was finished would have required admitting the program existed. It was partly genuine engineering belief. The teams that had built the N1 understood the failure modes now. The second launch's cause, a turbopump destroyed by foreign object ingestion, was solvable. The management structure knew this and said so in internal assessments. The program was not over. It was correcting. The third N1 launch took place on June 27, 1971. The vehicle lifted off cleanly. For the first 12 seconds, it performed better than either previous attempt. Then, at 50 seconds into the flight, an oxidizer leak began in the tail compartment. Leaking liquid oxygen in a compartment full of ignition sources is not a recoverable situation. The leak became a fire. Simultaneously, a combustion instability event in one engine triggered a cord shutdown sequence. The fire and the induced shutdown cascade combined to structurally weaken the tail section. The N1 began to rotate on its longitudinal axis. An uncontrolled rotating rocket, in the language of propulsion engineering, is a vehicle that is seconds from a structural failure. The rotation introduced aerodynamic loads the airframe was not designed to absorb. At 51 seconds after liftoff, the tail section failed. At 57 seconds, the vehicle was destroyed. The telemetry from the third flight was the most detailed the program had ever collected. The failure sequence was well documented. Engineers could see in the data precisely what had happened and in what order. Modifications were made. The fourth and final N1 began preparation. The fourth launch was on November 23, 1972. By this point, the changes to the vehicle were substantial. Kuznetsov's team had redesigned the NK-15 into a significantly improved variant, the NK-33, with materially better combustion stability characteristics. The cord system had been refined with updated logic intended to reduce false positive shutdown commands. A new propellant utilization system had been integrated. The engineers who had processed 3 catastrophic failures were prepared as they had never been before. The fourth N1 lifted off at night. It climbed through the altitude bands where the previous attempts had failed. At 90 seconds further than any N1 had previously flown, an anomaly developed in the propellant control system. A pressure oscillation built in the propellant feed lines and produced a resonance condition engineers call pogo, a violent longitudinal vibration that shakes a rocket the way a jackhammer shakes a drill. The pogo load exceeded the structural limits of the engine compartment. The N1's fourth flight ended at 106 seconds. 106 seconds, less than 2 minutes. In 4 attempts spanning 3.5 years, with a budget equivalent to billions of present-day dollars and the involvement of hundreds of thousands of Soviet workers, the N1 rocket never flew for more than 2 minutes. After the fourth failure, a government review was commissioned. The review concluded that the program would require at minimum 2 more years of development before a viable launch was achievable. The program was suspended in 1974 2 fully assembled N-1 vehicles, complete flight-ready rockets, were ordered destroyed rather than stored. They were disassembled. The launch pads were demolished. The tooling was scrapped. The manufacturing infrastructure was dismantled. The program had never officially existed. Therefore, it could not officially be cancelled. It was simply made to disappear. Open the archive files. The suppression of the N-1 program was not passive omission. It was active, systematic erasure conducted while the program was still running. Soviet space achievements were announced by TASS, the official state news agency, with remarkable speed when they were achievements. The Sputnik announcement came within hours of the launch. Gagarin's flight was reported the same day. The Luna 9 lunar landing in 1966 was celebrated extensively. The Soviet state understood that the space milestones were propaganda of the highest order and moved to claim them immediately. Failures were not announced. This was consistent policy. When Soyuz 1 crashed in 1967 and killed cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, the Soviets could not conceal a human death. They acknowledged it, but they did not disclose the full technical failure, the known structural problems that had been overridden by a political deadline, or the internal arguments before the mission about whether it was safe to fly. Komarov's family was given a pension and instructions to be quiet. For the N-1 program, the suppression went further than concealing failures. The existence of the program itself was classified. Engineers working on the N-1 were prohibited from discussing their work with family members. The N-1 launch complex at Baikonur occupied a different sector of the facility from the publicly acknowledged Soyuz and Proton pads. Personnel were compartmentalized by function. Even within Baikonur, people who worked on public programs were kept separate from people who worked on the classified one. American reconnaissance satellites began imaging the Baikonur region in the early 1960s. The imagery that showed the N-1 launch complex was analyzed by the CIA. What the analysts saw was a very large structure that did not match anything in the known Soviet launch inventory. Initial assessments considered several interpretations: large booster testing, military satellite programs, advanced ICBM development. The specific interpretation that this was a manned lunar launch facility solidified over years as imagery accumulated and construction progressed. Inside the Soviet Union, the official history of the space program contained no mention of the N-1. When Soviet cosmonauts gave public lectures, when engineers appeared on a state television, when Pravda published retrospective anniversaries of Soviet space achievements, the N-1 was absent. It had no name in official discourse. It had no existence. And the engineers who had built it were bound by classification from ever saying otherwise. After the program's termination in 1974, the physical record was systematically removed. The 2 completed flight vehicles were cut apart. The launch pads were torn down. Photographs and technical documents were classified at the highest level. Engineers received formal instructions not to discuss the program with anyone outside the cleared community. This suppression held substantially until the Soviet Union began to collapse. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies began loosening the grip of classification across Soviet institutions. In 1990, the N-1 was formally acknowledged in Soviet public media for the first time. 20 years after its second launch, had leveled a launch complex. In 1991, Soviet engineers began sharing documentation with Western counterparts for the first time. Some of that documentation, photographs, engineering drawings, test data, was sold commercially. The American aerospace company Aerojet purchased manufacturing rights to the NK-33 engine, the improved variant developed for the fourth in one flight. The NK-33 engine eventually flew on American rockets. The engine that was built to carry Soviet cosmonauts to the moon, buried for 2 decades, crossed the ocean, changed ownership, and kept working. As of the mid-2020s, certain categories of in-one program documentation, including specific casualty records and some internal failure analyses, remain partially restricted in Russian government archives. The full picture has still not been completely declassified. The cover-up was not perfect, but it lasted 20 years and it was thorough enough that for 20 years, the most catastrophic launch failure in the history of rocketry was, in the official record, a non-event. Read the chief designer's final report. Sergei Korolev died on January 14, 1966, during what was described as a routine surgical procedure for the removal of a colon tumor. He was 59 years old. The operation revealed unexpected complications, consequences in part of physical damage sustained during his years in the Gulag. His jaw, broken by interrogators in 1938, had healed incorrectly and made it impossible to properly intubate him when the procedure required it. He died on the operating table. His name was classified. The Soviet government, when it announced his death, identified him only as a leading scientist. No name? The man most responsible for the Soviet space program, the chief architect of every Soviet space achievement from 1957 through 1966, was listed in his own death announcement as anonymous. This is not a simplification or a misreading of the record. His actual death announcement contains no name. His real identity, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, was published for the first time in Pravda 3 days after his death. When concealing it further served no purpose, the West learned who he was at his funeral. They had been trying to find out for nearly a decade. His death created a leadership vacuum at the center of the Soviet space program that was never adequately filled. Vasily Mishin, Korolev's deputy, was appointed chief designer. Mishin was a competent engineer and a capable technical thinker. But he was not Korolev. He did not have Korolev's political authority, the hard-won ability to fight bureaucratic wars and win them. He did not have Korolev's instinct for knowing which compromises were acceptable and which would prove fatal. And he did not have the personal history that had made Korolev simultaneously feared and respected inside the Soviet system. Korolev had survived the Gulag and come back to lead the program. That history gave him an authority no successor could inherit. Under Mishin, the competing design bureaus that Korolev had managed through force of personality became more fractious. Valentin Glushko, who had refused to build engines for the N-1, whose enmity toward Korolev had constrained the program's architecture from its beginning, waited. He was patient. He was politically sophisticated in ways Mishin was not. After the fourth N-1 failure in 1972, Glushko moved. He outmaneuvered Mishin in the corridors of the Soviet space establishment. Mishin was removed as chief designer in 1974, the same year the N-1 program was suspended. Glushko replaced him. The man who had refused to build engines for the moon rocket became the head of the program the moon rocket had belonged to. The program was terminated under his authority. The two completed vehicles were destroyed under his authority. The pads were demolished under his authority. There is a counterfactual that space historians return to with some regularity. Korolev, in the years before his death, was actively pushing for the construction of a full-scale ground test stand for the N-1's first stage. He understood the risk of flying without one. He had enough political weight in 1964 and 1965 to make the argument. He was running out of time to get the decision finalized before his schedule, and his health ran out. The test stand was never built. If it had been, the failure modes that destroyed 4 rockets would have been found on the ground, not in the air, not over Baikonur, not at the cost of a launch pad and the people who were near it. Korolev knew it was necessary. He was fighting for it. He died on January 14, 1966, before the argument was resolved. Pull up the intelligence record. The American space program was conducted largely in public. NASA launches were broadcast live on national television. Mission profiles were released in advance. Successes and failures alike were visible to the American public, to Congress, and to the world. When Apollo 1 caught fire on the launch pad in January 1967 and killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, the event was immediately reported. The official investigation ran into hundreds of pages. It was reviewed by Congress and covered extensively by the press. The decision to ground the program for 18 months was publicly acknowledged, publicly debated, and publicly accepted. The Soviet program was the near-perfect opposite in every dimension. American intelligence agencies spent enormous effort across the 1960s trying to understand what the Soviets were actually building. The CIA's assessment of Soviet space capabilities in the late 1960s was, by the agency's own subsequent admission, substantially incomplete. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had been overflying Soviet territory since 1956. After Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960 and the program became publicly known, satellite reconnaissance took over. By the mid-1960s, American spy satellites were regularly imaging the Baikonur Cosmodrome. What they saw at Baikonur in late 1960s imagery was large-scale, purposeful construction. The N-1 launch complex was visible in the imagery. The scale of the structures was apparent. Analysis of that imagery produced assessments that were, in retrospect, partially correct and partially wrong in revealing ways. The CIA correctly assessed that the Soviets were building a large launch vehicle. They correctly assessed that it was intended for high-energy missions, either lunar or deep space military. They correctly assessed that the program was large enough to represent a genuine strategic capability that warranted continued monitoring. They did not know the timeline. They did not know about the management chaos inside the Soviet program. They did not know about the engine dispute, the cord system's vulnerabilities, the absence of full-stage ground testing. They did not know that the program's chief designer was dead and had been replaced by someone without the political authority to hold the program together. American intelligence assessments of Soviet lunar capabilities, declassified after the Cold War, show a consistent concern in the late 1960s and early 1970s that the Soviets might still accomplish something significant even after Apollo 11. There were genuine fears that the USSR would attempt an unmanned lunar sample return mission and present it publicly as a scientifically equivalent to or superior to manned missions, cheaper, safer, equally useful. The strategy would have been to reframe the terms of the competition after losing the original race. This fear was not irrational. The Luna 16 mission did successfully return lunar samples to Earth in September 1970, automatically with no crew aboard. The Soviets promoted it extensively, but the public framing of Luna 16 as a deliberate strategic choice rather than a fallback position was not entirely accurate. The robotic program had been planned in parallel with the manned one, and its success in 1970 partly concealed the depth of the manned program's failure. The second N1 launch, the July 3, 1969 explosion, was detected by American reconnaissance satellites. The imagery showed catastrophic damage to the Baikonur launch complex. American analysts understood that something very large had exploded at the N1 facility. The implications were significant, and they were passed through classified channels, but classified intelligence is not public, and the American space program continued on its own trajectory. By 1972, American intelligence had developed a reasonably accurate picture of the N1 program's status. The assessment was, the program is failing. But even in 1972, the full scope of the failure, 4 flights, 4 total losses, no vehicle surviving beyond 106 seconds, was not publicly known in the United States or anywhere outside the Soviet classified system. That full picture would not emerge until 1990. For 20 years, the most expensive and catastrophic failure in the history of a spaceflight remained to the world outside one classified Soviet bureaucracy, something that had never happened. Close the mission briefing, pull out the final report. The question this investigation set out to answer is simple to state and requires precision to answer correctly. How close did the Soviet Union actually come to landing a human being on the moon? Here is what the evidence confirms without qualification. The Soviet Union ran a genuine, well-funded, technically serious manned lunar program. This is not contested by any serious historian of the period. The N1 was real. The lunar lander, the LK, designed by Korolev's bureau, was real. Cosmonauts were assigned to lunar missions and conducted training for them. The program was not a bluff. It was not a propaganda exercise. It was a real attempt to do the thing. The N1 was not fundamentally unsound as a concept. The NK-33 engine, the improved version of the first stage engine, developed in the final years of the program, is by most engineering assessments a genuinely good engine. American companies purchased the technology after the Cold War. The NK-33 flew on American rockets into the 2020s. The engine worked. The problem was never the engine in isolation. The problem was the system. Here is what the evidence says clearly no to. The Soviet Union was not close to landing a human on the moon in 1969, not weeks away, not months away. The N1 rocket had not successfully completed a single flight. The lunar lander had not completed qualification testing. The life support systems were unfinished. Even a perfect N1 launch on July 3, 1969, even if the second vehicle had performed flawlessly, would not have produced a manned lunar landing within months. It would have produced one successful data point in a program that was years from its destination. The claim that the Soviets almost won in 1969 is inaccurate if it implies proximity to a manned landing. They were not near a manned landing. They were near proving their rocket could fly. Those are not the same thing. Here is what the evidence leaves genuinely open. Could the N-1 have been made to work with more time? The engineers who built it believed so, not as wishful thinking, but as a professional assessment based on understanding what had failed and why. The fourth vehicle was materially better than the first three. The NK-33 engine addressed the most serious combustion instability issues. The engineering team that had survived 4 catastrophic failures was technically prepared by 1974 in ways they had not been in 1969. Whether 2 more years of development would have produced a successful launch is not knowable because the program was cancelled before that time elapsed. The 2 completed N-1 vehicles that were destroyed without being launched in 1974 represent the most expensive unanswered engineering question in the history of a spaceflight. There was no way to retroactively test them. There is no way to know. What is certain is this: the moon race was not lost because Soviet engineers were inferior. They were not inferior. The NK-33 engine proved that the race was lost in a bureaucrat's refusal to design engines that didn't meet his propellant preferences. It was lost on an operating table in January 1966. It was lost in the political decision not to build the ground test stand that would have found the failure modes before they destroyed 4 rockets. It was lost in the years of maneuvering between design bureaus that should have been building hardware. And it was lost finally in the decision to bury the evidence of the loss so thoroughly that the engineers who came after could not learn from it, and the public that paid for it never knew. The N-1 existed 4 times. It stood on the pad at Baikonur. 4 times it lifted off, briefly, imperfectly, violently, and 4 times the record was closed and the pages were removed. The engineers who built it went back to work on other programs, constrained by classification, from ever saying what they had attempted, what they had learned, what they had come close to. For 20 years, the largest engineering effort the Soviet Union had ever directed toward a single machine was a fact the Soviet Union did not officially possess. The NK-33 engines, mothballed after the program's termination, sealed in preservative and placed in a warehouse in the Samara region, sat there for nearly 2 decades. When American engineers encountered them after the Cold War, they found them in preservation condition. Someone, across all those years of official denial, had maintained them, had kept them as though they might still matter. They did still matter. They flew on American rockets. The technology built to win a race that was then buried, crossed an ocean, changed hands, and kept working. The engines outlasted the erasure. What the N-1 story does not permit is a simple conclusion. It is not a story about technical failure, though technical failures occurred. It is not a story about deception, though deception was systematic. It is not a story about one side winning and the other losing, though that is what happened. It is a story about what occurs when an enormous human effort, years of work, thousands of careers, genuine engineering ambition, is conducted inside a system that cannot acknowledge its own mistakes. a system that classifies the evidence of failure as a security problem rather than a learning resource. NASA, after the Apollo 1 fire, investigated publicly. The report is publicly available. The findings changed the program. The program went on to succeed. The N1's failures were classified. The findings changed the program internally in ways that the engineers who made them could not discuss beyond the cleared perimeter. The program did not succeed. It was terminated and denied. The distance between those two outcomes is not a distance in engineering capability. It is not a distance in scientific knowledge. It is the distance between a system that can look at its failures honestly and a system that cannot afford to. One system learned, the other erased. 4 rockets, 4 explosions, 20 years of silence, and in a warehouse in Samara, in oil and preservation wrap, 30 engines waited, as though whoever sealed them there understood, even then, that the work was not finished, only interrupted. The file closes here. Oozes.